Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. As Afghanistan prepares for a presidential election, many in the political and media mainstream speak of the country's first democratic transition. This may or may not be true. What is less talked about is the dire security situation on the ground, whether Karzai is angling to succeed himself, the powerful presence of the Taliban, and whether the U.S. will ever actually leave Afghanistan. To cross-check the upcoming election in Afghanistan, I'm joined by John Glaser in Washington. He is a contributing editor at antiwar.com and a columnist for the Washington Times community section. Also in Washington, we have Michael Kugelman. He is an associate at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And in Philadelphia, we cross to Linh. He is a political commentator and a writer. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. John, the reason, if I can go to you first in Washington, well, the reason why I wanted to do this program is, number one, always make the American people and Western publics remember what we did in Afghanistan. That's always a top priority for me. Number two, looking at the headlines, democratic transition. This is the first democratic transition in Afghanistan. I'll give my opinion about that later. But don't you think that that's the wrong focus here, is that actually nothing very good has happened in Afghanistan in the last 12 years, and that's something Western media and political elites don't like to talk about anymore?
Well, there's really no actual practicing democracy to speak of in Afghanistan. What you have is a kleptocratic, corrupt state that has control over some of the country and doesn't have the ability to maintain security over even the parts that it supposedly controls. We have the state about 80% of the government's budget comes from abroad in foreign aid, so it can't sustain itself. And, you know, in terms of who will succeed Karzai, if it will be democratic, you know, that remains to be seen. I know that there will be some international observations of how the elections go, but previous elections have proven to be fraudulent, and many of the people running include warlords and insurgents and, you know, people that welcomed the Al-Qaeda people in back in the 90s. So, you know, it's hard really to talk about any functioning democracy in Afghanistan. And, you know, the United States has a lot of culpability for that.
Okay, Michael, I mean, talking about a transition in Afghanistan is a way for the United States to finally cut and run. They won't do it, obviously, using those terms, but they're still going to stay there. And isn't that really what the future of Afghanistan is about, is the kind of relationship, military relationship the United States and Afghanistan will have moving forward? It has very little to do with the election, actually.
Well, I actually wouldn't go that far. I don't think it's a sure thing that the United States is going to stay in Afghanistan. Literally, it will. There's going to be a development presence and a diplomatic presence for a number of years.
Yeah, but they're negotiating for nine bases, though, Michael. They want 9 bases for quote-unquote training purposes.
Right, they are. But those negotiations have been suspended, and there's increasing. I'm hearing things around town that this so-called zero option, in other words, an entire military withdrawal from Afghanistan, may not be out of the question, just because it's been so hard for the White House to work with Hamid Karzai. It's become a very tortured relationship. I agree with you. Certainly the U.S. government would want to maintain a residual force in Afghanistan, and that probably will end up happening. But, you know, I don't think we want to get ahead of ourselves. There may not be a residual presence in Afghanistan, and quite frankly, this election, this democratic transition, may be delayed. There may well not even be elections next year. You know, a number of Afghan politicians, powerful politicians close to Karzai, have said they're very uneasy about the idea of having an election, given the security situation and given the fact that the U.S. is withdrawing. And there's also indications that some of these politicians, again, close to Karzai, would not be happy with any of the presidential candidates. There are about 27 of them right now. So it's really a very uncertain, unclear situation right now.
Okay, Lynn, how do you read the tea leaves here? Because the U.S. certainly would like to maintain some kind of military presence there for purposes that could be explained within Afghanistan, outside of Afghanistan. Iran comes to mind, things like this here. But this seems like this is not even an amicable divorce between the United States and Afghanistan, particularly when we look at Mr. Karzai.
Well, we have to look more closely at why the U.S. is there in the first place, and that's for geopolitical reasons. Is to keep a check on Iran and to maintain a footprint in Central Asia. So with that in mind, the U.S. would definitely like to stay on beyond 2014. The reason why it's scaling back his involvement is because he's reached a kind of stalemate in his war with the Taliban. It cannot defeat the Taliban with 100,000 troops, so it will not be able to control the Taliban with 10 or 20,000 troops. And Karzai will be irrelevant soon enough because he's stepping down anyway, and the administration will collapse and his army will collapse. So the U.S. is pulling back because it's going broke at home, and his army is exhausted from fighting the Taliban, which it can't defeat. And the election itself will be illegitimate because the Taliban, which is the strongest force in Afghanistan, will not participate. It will even try to sabotage it. So my prediction for the future is that the Taliban will have a stronger presence after the U.S. scale back its presence there.
You know, John,